Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories.
First off, I would like to point out that I have changed several of the names, not to protect the guilty, but to avoid any frivolous lawsuits. Those I would win, however it would be time and money wasted. I still remember the day I got the keys to engine company number 7 like it was yesterday. I stood in front of that old fire station, hands in my pockets, leaning against the worn stone steps, just staring. The brass plaques beside the bay doors gleamed faintly in the morning sun, polished by years of history, not by anyone's elbow grease, and the faded letters across the front, Engine Company number 7, carried a weight that no modern house could ever give me. It was like the building had its own heartbeat, slow and steady, and for some reason it was beating in time with mine. Everyone thought I'd lost my mind. My realtor, God bless her, looked at me with that mixture of pity and disbelief that people reserve for someone who talks about wanting to buy a ghost town and live in it. "Hank," she said, her hands on her hips, "it's a fire station." I just smiled because I could feel it already, that spark that you get maybe once in a lifetime. "I know," I said. "That's the point." She shook her head and muttered something about contractors and resale value, but I wasn't listening. I'd looked at a dozen houses before that, all neat and identical, all the kind of places where people live but never feel alive. Nothing sparked anything in me. Not the row of ranch-style houses with beige siding, not the split levels with fake shutters, not the brick boxes that smelled like old carpeting and bad dreams. I didn't want a house that blended in. I wanted a home that carried stories in its walls, and from the moment I stepped inside that fire station, I knew I had found it. The scent of old wood, of iron and oil, of generations of firefighters who'd walked those halls, hit me like a punch and a comfort all at once. The purchase process was anything but simple. Heritage designation means lawyers, paperwork, inspections, and an endless list of do's and don'ts. But in a weird way, I loved it. People think restrictions are limiting, but I found them freeing. I could make the interior livable, modern, efficient, without erasing the soul of the building. I'd never been the kind of man to want a blank slate. I wanted character, history, something that demanded respect. And this place, it commanded it in every creak of the floorboards, every dented corner of the bay doors, every faded bit of paint that refused to scrub away. I worked within the rules, and I made it mine. The living quarters took shape in the old recreation room. I installed proper insulation, updated the electrical and plumbing, put in a kitchen that actually made sense for day-to-day life, but all of it was invisible from the street. From the outside, Engine Company number 7 looked almost exactly like it had in 1937. Brass signage, bay doors, the heritage plaque from the State Historical Society, all untouched. I mounted that plaque near the front entrance, and if I'm honest, I think I spent more time looking at it than any of my furniture. It wasn't just a metal plate. It was a validation, proof that I hadn't wrecked something precious, that I had somehow found a balance between modern life and history. The neighborhood fit perfectly around the station. Older homes, established trees with roots deep enough to crack sidewalks if they wanted, people who'd been there 20, 30 years, some longer. Folks who didn't peek over fences, who nodded politely when they passed and left you to your business. Walt, my neighbor across the street, retired machinist in his 70s, waved every morning from his porch. Never said much about the fire station except, "Looks like you got your work cut out for you, Hank." Nice place, and that was it. No lectures, no unsolicited advice, just a warm acknowledgement from a man who understood work and pride. I felt like I'd stumbled into exactly the right place, like the universe had handed me the keys because it knew I'd treat the building right. Then one afternoon it happened. I pulled the mail from my mailbox and found a bright little flyer, folded once, shoved neatly into the stack of bills and junk mail. Neighborhood meeting, homeowners association formation. I read it once, set it on the counter next to the coffee maker, and promptly forgot about it. Didn't think much of it. Not unusual in a neighborhood this old. Maybe just some people trying to organize social events or maintain landscaping standards. I had work to do, renovations to supervise, permits to sign, plumbing to worry about. The flyer was paper, easily forgotten until it was. Looking back, I suppose that flyer marked the start of something I'd never expected, something I'd never asked for. But at that moment, standing in the glow of morning light, smelling sawdust and linseed oil, I didn't care. I had my fire station. I had the brass plaques, the bay doors, the faded letters, the plaque from the Historical Society. I had a building that had survived decades and had survived me. And for the first time in years, I felt proud in a way that didn't require anyone else's approval. My friends called me crazy when I told them what I bought. "You bought a fire station," they said, shaking their heads. "Why not a house?" I shrugged. "Because it's a fire station," I replied. "Because it's perfect," and for the first 6 months it was. I'd wake up in the old bunk room I'd converted into a bedroom, make coffee in a kitchen carved out of the old rec room, and wander outside just to run my hands along the brass plaques and think about the history beneath my feet. The neighbors were quiet, respectful, and Walt waved every day, which counted as community in my book. Life was simple, warm, and good. And then the flyer sat on my counter, quietly waiting. A little piece of paper that I had tossed aside, thinking it irrelevant. But it was. It was a whisper of the storm that was coming, though I didn't know it yet. I can't say that I regret buying Engine Company number 7. It's the best mistake I ever made. It gave me a home, a challenge, and for a brief shining moment, a sense of pride I hadn't felt in years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That flyer, that small, harmless piece of paper, was about to change everything. The next flyer came a week later, slipped into the mailbox like a threat wrapped in pastel paper. I hardly looked at it at first, just set it on the counter beside the first one, thinking it was probably some reminder about the meeting or another neighborly notice about street parking or yard maintenance. The third flyer, though, caught my attention. Something about the language was different. It wasn't asking anymore, it was declaring. "Your neighborhood association has officially formed," the flyer read in bold letters across the top. Officers had been appointed. Bylaws had been drafted. And most shockingly, there was a section listing every property supposedly under its jurisdiction. My address was there, right in the middle. There it was in black and white, Engine Company number 7, under the mandatory membership clause. I laughed at first, a low, incredulous chuckle. Mandatory. Me? That wasn't possible. I spent the next several hours digging. I pulled neighborhood plat maps, scrolled through property deed records, and read every state statute I could find about HOAs and voluntary associations. By the time I sat back in my chair, coffee cold on the counter, I had confirmed what my gut had already been yelling at me. In a neighborhood like this, where no HOA covenant was attached to the original property deeds, membership was, and always would be, voluntary. No one could force me to join. No one could make me pay dues. No one could compel compliance with rules I never agreed to. I wrote it down on a yellow sticky note, pinned it firmly to the corkboard above the kitchen counter, and nodded at it like it was a talisman. But it was Walt who first made me realize that this wasn't going to be a simple, forgettable matter. I wandered over one Saturday morning, coffee in hand, just to chat. Walt leaned over the fence, squinting in the sun, and I could see the faint crease in his brow. "Hank," he said, lowering his voice, "you need to hear what went down at the meeting." I raised an eyebrow. "Meeting?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He gestured for me to step closer. "Yeah." Out of curiosity, I went. "Just thought I'd see what the fuss was about." "Big mistake," he shook his head slowly. "You know Dennis Cloverfeld, right? She's the one running the show. Moved in 3 years ago, thinks she's the mayor of the street already." I laughed. "I've seen her around. Nice enough lady." "Nice." "Hank, she's like a minor natural disaster." Walt gestured with both hands as if to underscore the scale of the impending chaos. "Deborah and Susan are with her. Deborah's all fire and brimstone. Every word she says comes out loud and aggressive, like she's auditioning for a courtroom drama. Susan's quiet, but don't let that fool you. She takes notes like she's filing charges against you before you even finish your sentence. Together, they steamroll everything. They've got pre-written bylaws and they just run over people." I sipped my coffee and tried not to smirk. "So what, they've got the whole neighborhood in line?" Walt exhaled, A slow puff of exasperation. Almost. They've got a lot of people scared into going along. But listen, Hank, they talked about your building. Called it an eyesore. I laughed sharp and incredulous. An eyesore. Walt, it's a historic landmark. He shrugged like a man who had accepted the fundamental strangeness of the world. Doesn't matter to Dennis. If it ain't beige, it's a problem. She actually pointed at your fire station during the meeting and said it sets a precedent. We can't have structures that stand out like that, she said. Can you imagine? I can, I muttered, shaking my head. I can imagine it all too clearly. What did people say? Walt made a face. A few tried to speak up. One lady, she lives 2 doors down, very polite, said she thought it added charm. Dennis just smiled and ignored her. Deborah jumped in and said she agreed completely. That charm wasn't enough if it lowered property values. Susan was writing everything down, nodding like she was cataloging evidence. You wouldn't believe how efficiently they ran that meeting. Nobody got a word in. I felt a little chill run down my spine. The flyer had seemed harmless, almost silly at first. Now, hearing Walt describe these 3 women like generals in a small-scale war, I could feel the first stirrings of something darker than irritation. And the rules, Walt continued, leaning back against the fence, they've got a whole list. Paint colors, yard maintenance, fences, what you can see from the street. They want conformity. Beige. Everything beige. Your black bay doors. That's a violation already in their eyes. They didn't say it to me directly, but it's in the bylaws they distributed. I only skimmed it, but it's all there. I laughed bitterly this time. Beige. Right. And I suppose the brass plaques are on the chopping block next. Walt chuckled. You might want to keep a camera on them just in case. A few days later, the reality sank in even further. An envelope arrived, crisp and formal, printed on HO, a letterhead. I tore it open at the kitchen counter, heart thumping, not with excitement, but with a creeping sense of absurdity mixed with frustration. It wasn't a polite invitation to join. It wasn't even phrased as a question. It stated outright that I was already a member, that dues were owed, and that my property had been flagged for review. I dropped the envelope on the counter and rubbed my eyes. I don't know what to say. Walt, visiting later that afternoon for his weekly coffee chat, peered at it and whistled. That's aggressive. They just assume ownership, huh? Assume, indeed, I muttered, flipping the letter over like maybe the other side had some kind of footnote. They're claiming authority over me that they literally cannot have. I checked the law, Walt. There's nothing. No covenant, no precedent, no clause. They can't force me to join. He nodded slowly, setting his mug down. Yeah, that's what I thought. But knowing that and dealing with them, that's different. They've got momentum. They've got neighbors scared, and once they have a foothold, they get bold. I wouldn't be surprised if the next letter says something about fines or inspections. I groaned, running a hand through my hair. Fine or not, I'm not paying. Not joining. Not a chance. And inspections. I'll show them every permit, every approval. I've done everything legally. They've got nothing. Walt leaned on the counter like he was settling in for a long conversation. I don't doubt that, Hank. I really don't. But it's the principle, right? That's what gets people. They like making rules, watching everyone scramble to obey. And you're the fire station guy. Out of step already. You're the temptation. They'll come for you. Come for me, I repeated, tasting the words. They sounded strange, almost absurd, but a little nerve-jangling at the same time. I've seen her in the neighborhood, Dennis. She's like a tornado in a blazer. Deborah and Susan are the wind and the debris. You're saying they've already got enough neighbors scared to do what they want. He nodded. Exactly. And they're clever. They frame everything as helping property values. Curb appeal. Community standards. You challenge it, you're the troublemaker. You go along, you keep your peace. That's the game. I sipped my coffee, staring out the window at the fire station. Brass glinting faintly in the late afternoon sun, bay doors shining black against the pale stone, The letters still faded but proud. Engine Company Number 7. The whole building looked untouchable, permanent. And yet, I felt a faint, sinking awareness that permanence alone wouldn't protect me from people with enough confidence and enough audacity to claim otherwise. Walt leaned back in his chair, giving me a long, slow look. "Hank, you're in for it. I'm just telling you what I've seen. Keep your wits about you. They play nice until they don't. And then, well, you'll know." I set my mug down with more force than necessary, staring at the corkboard where my sticky note reminded me of the law. Voluntary. Always voluntary. No one could compel me. And yet, staring at that note, at the fire station outside, I couldn't help but feel the first prickling edge of tension creeping into what had been a peaceful, proud little corner of the world. Something was coming. Something that wanted to drag my Engine Company Number 7 into a world it had never asked to enter. And for the first time since I got the keys, I wasn't entirely sure I liked what I saw. I read the letter twice before I even allowed myself to react. The first time I skimmed it, thinking maybe I was misreading something. The second time, I went line by line, slowly, deliberately, just to make sure I understood it correctly. And yes, it said exactly what I thought it said. I was in violation of HOA guidelines regarding exterior aesthetics. I owed dues, dating all the way back to the association's founding, and if I didn't respond within 30 days, there would be further action. Not a hint that membership was voluntary. Not a single acknowledgement of my heritage designation. It was written in polished, bureaucratic language, the kind of language that assumes compliance is automatic, as though my agreement had been a foregone conclusion. I sat at the kitchen table for a long while, the envelope lying beside my coffee, and I just stared at it. I'm not the kind of man who fires off letters in anger. That's sloppy. You act first and think later, and I wanted to think first. I wanted precision, documentation, and clarity. I got out my laptop and drafted a response that was polite, firm, and meticulously documented. I cited the voluntary nature of the association, attached a copy of the relevant state statute on HOA formation, referenced my heritage designation and the legal protections it carried, and closed by noting that I wished the HOA well in its voluntary endeavors, but that I would not be participating. I printed it, signed it, and then mailed it certified, return receipt requested. My gut told me to keep records. This was going to matter. 3 days later, I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but the sound made me pause anyway. It was deliberate, confident, the kind of knock that says the person on the other side expects to be admitted. I opened the door and there she was, Dennis Cloverfeld. She isn't named Karen, but make no mistake, her behavior was pure Karen. Entitled, infuriatingly arrogant, radiating that particular mix of self-assuredness and moral superiority that makes you want to either roll your eyes or slam a door in her face. Well-dressed, composed, leather portfolio in hand, like she just walked into a boardroom rather than my front steps. Behind her, standing almost theatrically on the sidewalk, were Deborah and Susan, forming a loose formation that somehow managed to feel both casual and deliberate, the kind of backup presence designed to be noticed without saying a word. Mr. Duval, Hank, we're simply trying to maintain the integrity of this neighborhood, Dennis said, that smile she had that didn't reach her eyes, all charm and no warmth. Dennis, I said, keeping my tone even, this building has been here since 1937. It has a state heritage plaque on the wall. It was maintaining the integrity of this neighborhood long before either of us was born. Her smile flickered for just a fraction of a second. The designation, she said carefully, doesn't exempt you from community standards. Actually, I said, holding my ground, it does. In writing. Would you like a copy? She looked at me like I'd said something rude, the kind of expression that mixes disbelief with the faintest hint of irritation. Dennis didn't raise her voice, didn't snap or stomp. She just radiated that entitled energy that feels louder than any words could. And then the conversation began its endless, circular dance. We all have to contribute to the neighborhood, she said, voice measured, deliberate. Community standards ensure property values remain high. We are protecting the investment of every resident. Dennis, I replied, I respect that you care about property values. I also respect the law, and the law is clear. I am not required to join a voluntary association, nor am I required to alter the exterior of a state-designated historic building. Those protections are in place precisely to prevent what you are proposing. She pursed her lips, leaning ever so slightly on her portfolio. We are speaking of more than legality. We are speaking of responsibility. Stewardship. The appearance of your property reflects on the community as a whole. I leaned against the doorframe, folding my arms. Responsibility, stewardship, appearance, sure. But my responsibility is already defined by state law, and my stewardship has been ongoing for decades. I have documented every change, every update, every renovation in compliance with all applicable codes and protections. That should suffice. She shook her head, that little tilt she does when she thinks she's about to enlighten a lesser mind. You misunderstand. This is about consensus. Participation. Membership in the HOA is not merely voluntary. It is expected of every property owner within the defined boundaries. It is for the greater good. I couldn't help it. I let a short, bitter laugh escape. Not voluntary. That's exactly what I said when I read your letter. And as for the greater good, well, the greater good doesn't get to decide what color my bay doors are, does it? The smile returned, tight and practiced. We are asking you to consider your role in the neighborhood, Mr. Duval. You have a responsibility to your neighbors, to the community, to history itself. Your building, as distinguished as it is, still needs to conform to the standards we've established for all properties. I pinched the bridge of my nose. Dennis, the only standard that applies to me legally is the one protecting historic properties. I'm already exceeding every reasonable expectation by maintaining it. I will not be paying dues or altering the exterior. There is no legal or moral basis to compel me to join a voluntary association. Her smile faltered slightly again, just a flicker like she was recalculating. Then she straightened, tucking her portfolio under her arm. Mr. Duval, we hope you will reconsider. The neighborhood thrives when everyone participates willingly. Thank you for your time. She turned, and Deborah and Susan fell into step beside her, moving down the sidewalk with a kind of measured grace that was part performance, part intimidation. Deborah's grin was sharp and knowing, Susan silent but all eyes and ears, cataloging, recording. I watched them go, my hands clenched at my sides, the door still open. For a long moment I just stood there, staring at the empty sidewalk. Not angry exactly. Not yet. But a sense of resolve settled in my chest, heavy and steady. This wasn't a disagreement that would dissolve if I ignored it. This was the start of a war of wills. And I knew, in a way that was both thrilling and exhausting, that I had to be meticulous, precise, and patient. 2 weeks later, the next letter arrived. I opened it slowly, already dreading the contents, and found it included a fine. A monetary penalty, formally assessed, with all the bureaucratic flourish you could imagine, violation notices, itemized charges, and an insistence that payment was due. I set it down on the counter, staring at the brass plaque across the way. Engine Company Number 7 had survived decades, weathered storms, and been preserved for the sake of history. But now it was facing a storm of a different sort, a storm fueled by entitlement, arrogance, and the absurd certainty of someone named Dennis Cloverfeld, a Karen in every sense that mattered, backed by 2 devoted allies who seemed to believe that rules, whether legal or not, were theirs to enforce. And for the first time, I realized just how long this fight was going to be. I spread the letters out on the kitchen table like evidence in a crime scene. Each envelope seemed to carry a fresh absurdity, a new justification for harassment. I picked up the first one and read it slowly, word by word, as if speaking them aloud might make them vanish. The brass signage beside the front entrance, polished to a glow I was proud of, was now non-compliant with neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. My original bay doors, black iron and wood, were commercial in appearance and inconsistent with residential standards. Even the paint, the historic heritage-protected paint that had been there since Franklin Roosevelt was president, was suddenly listed as a non-approved color. I laughed, sharp and short, partly from incredulity and partly because if I didn't laugh, I might have thrown something. Then I picked up the next letter. And the next, each one more ridiculous than the last, citing my landscaping, my mailbox, the angle of my porch light. It was as if breathing in this neighborhood required written approval. I laid them all out in a neat row and ran my finger along the edges, a private ritual of frustration, like a detective studying a crime scene. I called Thomas Webb that evening. Thomas has a way of speaking that makes it clear he has already seen every version of human stupidity and considers it, at most, mildly entertaining. Exactly what I needed. "Thomas," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "you've got to hear this. They're citing my signage, my bay doors, my paint. They've included fines for things that don't even make sense. I mean, they actually wrote that my porch light is non-compliant with nothing." He listened quietly, as he always does, a faint sigh somewhere between patience and amusement. When I finished, he spoke, measured and calm. "They can send you fines until the paper runs out," Thomas said. "Doesn't mean a thing. An HO, a fine against a non-member, is like a parking ticket from someone's kid with a toy badge." I blinked at him over the phone. "So that's it. Done?" He let out a slow breath. "Hank, people like this are never done. But you're protected on every front they've tried so far. Let me send a letter on firm letterhead, lay it out legally. That might cool them off." "Go ahead," I said, already knowing it wouldn't. I had learned long ago that certainty was a stranger in dealings with entitled people. Thomas's letter went out the next week, precise, referencing state statutes on voluntary association, citing my heritage designation, and outlining the legal consequences of continued harassment. A bulletproof letter, the kind that should have ended things. But apparently, Dennis Cloverfeld and her team didn't read the memo. Instead, things escalated. Dennis, Deborah, and Susan were suddenly everywhere. Dennis went door to door, claiming the HOA was mandatory, that anyone within the boundary had to join or face consequences. Her voice, calm and authoritative, dripped entitlement. Deborah echoed everything she said, louder and sharper. Susan was quiet but methodical, taking notes, cataloging every home's compliance or lack thereof. It was theater and intimidation all rolled into one, and it was working. 2 neighbors, people I'd been friendly with for years, signed on within a week. Walt came over the following morning, shaking his head slowly as he leaned against his fence post. "She told the Hendersons they could be sued if they didn't join," Walt said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "That's not true," I said, immediately standing straighter. "I know it's not true," he said, "but they don't know it's not true. That's the problem." I rubbed my forehead and muttered, "So now it's a game of intimidation." "Fantastic." That evening, I installed 4 additional security cameras, positioning them to cover every angle of the exterior. I told myself it was just prudence, the reasonable act of a man who's involved in a legal dispute. Mostly, I believed that. Then came Thursday. I pulled into the driveway, and they were there. Dennis, Deborah, and Susan, standing on the public sidewalk, cameras and phones in hand, systematically photographing the building. They didn't acknowledge me. Didn't wave. Didn't speak. Just the 3 of them, capturing every angle, as if taking possession through pixels and prints could somehow bend the law. I went inside, poured a glass of water, and settled in front of my monitors. I watched them move with precision. Deborah leaned in close to examine some detail. Susan circled behind, meticulous, recording everything. And Dennis, the architect of this absurd campaign, stood at the front, clipboard in hand, pencil tapping lightly, eyes scanning, sharp and calculating. Half an hour later, they left, walking down the street in that same casual yet deliberate formation. I could almost hear the faint click of imaginary badges. I set my glass down, staring at the brass plaque over the entrance. Engine Company Number 7 had survived storms, fire, and decades of neglect. And now it faced a storm of a different kind, one made of entitlement, arrogance, and relentless care and energy. I sank into the chair and let out a long breath. It wasn't anger exactly, not yet. It was disbelief, frustration, and the faint beginnings of resolve. These people were convinced they had the authority of law on their side, but they didn't. I had statutes, records, and history on my side. and I was going to use every bit of it, methodically, patiently. I called Walt that night. "You saw them, didn't you?" "Took notes. Every angle," he said. "Like a small army. I'm going to document everything. Cameras, letters, interactions. Every single thing." "You'll need it," he said, a quiet note of concern creeping in. "They're not going to stop." I knew he was right. And for the first time, I realized just how long this was going to go on, how much persistence it would take. But I also knew the fire station was more than just a building. It was a symbol, a line in the sand. And I wasn't moving it. By the time I went to bed that night, the absurdity had taken on a sharper edge. This wasn't just letters anymore. This wasn't just claims. This was a campaign of intimidation, masquerading as civic duty. And I was standing directly in its path, armed with nothing but the law, common sense, and a growing sense of righteous stubbornness. It was a Tuesday morning, gray and unremarkable, the kind that lulls you into routine. I noticed the envelope sitting among the usual bills and flyers in the mail slot, a standard-sized manila with a neat, typed address. My first instinct was to ignore it for a minute. Routine, I told myself. County notices usually were. I made a coffee, leaned against the counter, and for a moment let the normal rhythm of the morning carry me. Then I picked up the envelope and looked at it. Something about the weight felt different. I slid it open carefully, the edges of the paper crisp under my fingers, and pulled out the letter. I started reading. Slowly at first. Then again. And a third time, because my mind refused to register the words fully the first two passes. A lien. Filed against my property. By the Neighborhood Homeowners Association. I sank into a chair, letting the letter rest in my lap like it had physical weight. Unpaid dues. Accumulated fines. Several $1,000s. Attached to my property title like a barnacle to a ship's hull. I set the letter down and stared at the brass plaque on the wall opposite me. Engine Company Number 7. Since 1937. This building had survived storms, fires, decades of neglect, and now it was being assaulted in paper and ink. My first reaction was not an eruption of heat or yelling. It was a cold, deliberate stillness, the kind of feeling that stretches from your chest into your bones, steady and resolute. This was no ordinary letter. This was no bureaucratic overreach that could be tossed in a drawer or laughed off. This was real. Filed at the county recorder's office. Attached to my legal title. Capable of complicating a sale, a refinance, or any financial transaction that touched my home. I picked up the phone before I even let the letter rest fully on the counter. Thomas Webb answered on the second ring, voice calm, steady, but I could hear it, just beneath the surface, the rare undertone of genuine anger. "They filed a lien," he said, not as a question, not even as disbelief, but as fact. "Yes," I said. "A lien. On my property. For dues I do not owe. On a building with a heritage designation. Against a non-member," he clarified. "A non-member with a heritage designation." "On what legal basis?" I asked, my voice tight. "None that I can find," Thomas said. Silence stretched on the line, heavy and precise, as though the pause itself could measure the absurdity. Then he said, quietly but firmly, "Hank, this just became a different kind of case." I slumped against the counter. My mind ran through the implications. 11 weeks. That's how long it took the county to strike the lien once it was filed. 11 weeks during which my property would bear the weight of someone else's audacity. 11 weeks during which I'd have to disclose it for insurance reviews, banking inquiries, and the casual curiosity of anyone running a title search. 11 weeks of knowing that someone out there considered it acceptable to file a fraudulent lien. Thomas walked me through the process, methodical as ever. There were filings to make, evidence to present, notices to serve. He explained clearly that legally, we were in solid ground. The lien was baseless, fraudulent, and demonstrably unenforceable. But legally sound or not, I had to endure the existence of this instrument. I felt every day like a small, cornered animal in my own home. And during those 11 weeks, the harassment didn't stop. Letters kept arriving, each more audacious than the last. One day, I found a handwritten note folded into my mailbox. My first thought was instinctive irritation. Tampering with a mailbox is a federal offense, and this qualified. But I didn't escalate. I slipped it into a folder and read it carefully. The note was brief, scrawled in cursive that could have belonged to anyone, yet unmistakably deliberate. My property was disrespectful to the community standards. No signature, no attempt at conversation, just judgment inked in blue pen. Deborah. She had the audacity, the patience, the certainty that this was her right. Susan, the quiet one, started showing up as well. Alone sometimes, walking slowly past the building, pausing occasionally, just standing. I watched her through the cameras, cataloged her comings and goings. There was something about the way she watched, silent and meticulous, that made the hairs on my neck prick. The unease was specific, a targeting of presence rather than action, a study of reaction. She never approached. She didn't knock. She simply observed. I documented everything methodically. Each letter, each note, each camera recording filed and timestamped. Every encounter with them cataloged in detail. By the end of the third week, the routine of logging, photographing, and observing had become part of my days, a grim rhythm that made the absurdity tangible. At night, I found sleep difficult. The house was quiet, the brass gleamed under soft lighting, and yet the image of that Leon, attached to my property, hovered in my mind. I thought about the kind of person who would file such a thing. What compulsion drove them? The satisfaction of control, the thrill of authority, the thin veneer of civic responsibility, masking the thrill of harassment. Each morning I made my way to the window, checked the cameras, and counted the angles. Each day I reminded myself I was protected. Each day I reminded myself this was temporary, the law on my side. But the tension was a shadow at my shoulder, a silent companion I could not dismiss. Finally, 11 weeks later, Thomas called. I could hear a rare edge of triumph in his voice. "It's gone," he said. "The lien is struck. Filed incorrectly, unsupported, baseless. It's off the record." I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by exhaustion, the kind that seeps into muscles and bones. But Thomas wasn't finished. His tone shifted subtly, no longer news, now warning. "Now," he said, "you need to think seriously about next steps. Because the other side certainly is. Filing that lien, they're not bluffing. And they know what they're doing. You need a plan. This won't be the last move." I sat back, staring at the window at the empty sidewalk, imagining the three of them somewhere nearby, scheming, calculating. Dennis, Deborah, Susan, entitled, precise, unyielding. The gloves were on. For the first time, I understood fully that this was no longer a dispute about paint colors or signage. This was escalation. This was deliberate, calculated, aggressive action designed to test boundaries and provoke submission. And I would meet it head-on. I poured a glass of whiskey, slow and deliberate, letting it warm my hands. Engine Company Number 7 stood silent behind me, untouched by the petty absurdity of bureaucracy and malice. It had survived fire, neglect, storms, and time. And now it would survive this. I allowed myself a small, bitter smile. The next steps were clear in my mind. Cameras, documentation, letters, legal filings. Everything I had learned over decades of managing projects, navigating bureaucracy, and standing my ground would come into play. But for now, the lien was gone. The house was mine, unencumbered. The war, though, had only begun. The lien was gone, finally, and for one rare evening I let myself feel it, real relief. I poured a beer, sat on the steps of the fire station, and let the dusk settle across the old stone steps. The bay doors reflected the fading light, the brass plaques glinting faintly, and for a moment the world seemed quiet. I allowed myself to imagine a return to normal, a kind of equilibrium after weeks of escalating harassment. That evening ended quietly, and the next morning the reality arrived like a slow frost. Dennis had apparently concluded that if legal instruments, certified letters, and liens weren't enough to bend me, social pressure might be. The campaign shifted from paperwork to people. It started subtly at first. A neighbor passing me on the sidewalk would nod, but their eyes flicked away too quickly. A wave that used to be warm and casual now landed stiffly, fingers barely lifting from a pocket. Invitations that had been regular, friendly gestures to block gatherings stopped coming. I noticed, but I didn't comment, telling myself not to assume, not yet. Walt, leaning on his fence across the street, eventually gave me the first clear glimpse of what was happening. He had that careful honesty of a good neighbor, the kind that delivers uncomfortable truths with minimal ceremony. "Dennis S. been talking," he said, voice low, hesitant, "at the HOA meetings. She's been saying things about you. About your building." "What kind of things?" I asked, keeping my tone even, coffee in hand. Walt shifted, ran a hand across his neck, the old retired machinist uneasily adjusting to speaking his mind. "She's been suggesting you're the reason property values aren't rising as they should. That your building, well, it lowers the aesthetic standard of the street. That your refusal to join is selfish. Toward the community." I blinked. She called me a bad neighbor. In those exact words. Walt's jaw tightened, and he looked like a man caught between truth and discomfort. I glanced across the street, eyes resting on the familiar facade of Engine Company Number 7. "Walt," I said slowly, "that building was a fire station for 40 years. The men who lived and worked here ran into burning buildings to save strangers. And she wants to call that a bad neighbor." Walt didn't respond verbally. He simply nodded, slowly, deliberately, the kind of nod that acknowledges your point while silently admitting it changes nothing. It didn't stop there. Dennis moved outward, toward the businesses on the corner, a dry cleaner and a small hardware store. Both were longtime fixtures of the block, and both were neutral in neighborhood disputes. Yet she arrived, impeccably dressed, portfolio under her arm, and suggested to the owners that aligning with the HOA would be good for business. She implied, delicately but firmly, that certain property owners, me, of course, might be creating complications for the community. At the hardware store, I learned later from George, the owner, that her visit had left him uneasy. George was a man of practical solutions and minimal drama, the kind of person you trust with tools and advice. Yet when he told me about it, I saw the discomfort etched in his face. "She came by," he said, hands fiddling with the strap of a canvas bag. "And well, she made it sound like if we don't support the HOA, it might cause trouble." I didn't know what to say. I just didn't know what to say. I listened, nodded, and said nothing, maintaining composure in public as always. That was my rule: keep calm, avoid escalation. Let Thomas handle the letters, the formal communications, the legal edge of this mess. But inside, a quiet fire was starting. I began keeping a log, a precise record of incidents, dates, times, who was involved, witnesses, any notes I could muster. Not because Thomas required it, though he did, but because it gave my mind a task, a way to channel the accumulating anger into something deliberate and controlled. Each entry in the log was a small act of preparation, a mapping of the battlefield. The cameras, the ones I had installed after the lien, were about to prove their worth. By the second week, Susan started showing up regularly, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by Deborah or Dennis. She would stand at the edge of the sidewalk, arms folded, just looking at the fire station, taking her time, cataloging angles, lingering in ways that made the skin crawl. I could track her movements, see her cross from sidewalk to parking strip, back and forth, timing her visits like she was conducting reconnaissance. One Saturday afternoon, Deborah and Dennis were outside, clipboard in hand, walking slowly up and down the street, pointing at driveways and hedges. Walt leaned over his fence and muttered something about their obsession with order, shaking his head slowly. I watched from the kitchen window, sipping coffee, feeling the peculiar mixture of irritation and grim amusement that comes with observing absurdity in action. I had to admit they were good at this, social manipulation, that is. Dennis, especially, had a way of commanding attention, projecting authority without lifting her voice. People nodded when she spoke, murmured agreements, avoided confrontation. I could see it clearly now. The HOA was no longer about dues, bylaws, or architecture. It was about influence, control, perception. The lien was just one tool. Now they were wielding peer pressure like a club. The subtlety of it struck me. Neighbors who once exchanged pleasantries now glanced away when I waved. Small favors I used to be asked to join, helping with the block party, offering rides, even casual visits, had evaporated. Invitations, like the one to the Spring Street barbecue, never arrived. The neighborhood, which had felt like a community, was fracturing quietly, invisibly around me. Walt stopped by that afternoon. He leaned on the fence, the familiar rhythm of our morning chats broken by a new tension. "They're talking," he said, voice low. "About you. About what happens if people don't join." "Dennis, she's persistent." "I know," I said, watching Susan linger at the corner for a few moments before walking on. "It's the social pressure now, isn't it? The quiet campaign." He nodded slowly. "Exactly. And the worst part, some people don't even know it's pressure. They think it's just normal. That's how Dennis works. She's subtle until you realize it's been there all along." I exhaled, feeling the weight of it settle like dust on my shoulders. The cameras, the logs, the documentation, they were no longer just tools, they were shields. Every movement outside, every encounter would be tracked, recorded, cataloged. I would meet their quiet intimidation with quiet preparedness. That night, as the streetlights flickered on and the neighborhood settled into evening routines, I reviewed my log. Each entry marked an escalation, a strategy, a pattern. Dennis was no longer just an overzealous a president. She was orchestrating a campaign, moving pieces across the neighborhood, testing boundaries and measuring reactions. The other two, Deborah and Susan, acted as extensions of that strategy, carrying it forward in person, in notes, in observation. I felt the first true taste of isolation, not complete but significant. Not because anyone disliked me, not because the building was unattractive, but because they had decided it would be so. Social compliance, orchestrated like clockwork, could be just as oppressive as any legal threat. And for the first time, I understood the scope of the challenge. It was no longer about law or heritage plaques. It was about presence, perception, and power. And so I resolved. Cameras in place, logbooks ready, records meticulously filed. If they wanted a war, I would meet them with strategy, observation, and patience. The battle was no longer abstract. It had become every sidewalk, every glance, every conversation. The social assault had begun. I didn't hear a thing that night. Not a footstep, not the scrape of metal, not the hiss of aerosol. I'm a reasonably light sleeper, usually waking if the wind rattles the bay doors, but the world was silent, or maybe I was just too deep in it to notice. Morning came in pale strips of light through the blinds, and I swung the front door open, expecting nothing more than the usual quiet street. It hit me instantly. Red, vivid, ugly, a word I don't need to repeat, spray-painted across the stone face of Engine Company Number 7. Right below the heritage designation plaque, as if someone had considered the exact placement. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. A message about the building, about its history, about me. I froze for a long minute, staring at the letters that screamed across the morning light, the mortar lines of the old stone building suddenly seeming sharper, angrier somehow. The brass plaques glinted in the early sun, the bay doors stood intact and still proud, but that red slash of defiance changed everything. I went back inside slowly, coffee forgotten on the counter, and pulled up the camera footage. The timestamp blinked at me too, 17 a.m. There she was. One of Dennis's crew. Hood up, face partially obscured, but I know her. I've watched her for weeks. The gait, the build, the bright green jacket she favors, there's no mistaking it. She moves with purpose, quick and methodical, checks the street briefly, and then retraces her steps, vanishing into the shadows. I watched it 4 times. Not because I doubted what I'd seen. Not because I needed proof. I needed certainty. Absolute certainty. When you're about to do what I was about to do, you can't afford a moment of doubt. I didn't have any. By 7 a.m., the coffee cold and my hands shaking slightly, I called Thomas. He picked up on the second ring, voice calm as always, like he already knew the day would start with bad news. I summarized everything in a single sentence: the word, the placement, the timestamp, the footage. There was a pause. Then Thomas spoke, and his voice had shifted, focused, deliberate, a precision I've rarely heard outside a courtroom. Don't touch the building, he said. Document everything. Photograph the damage in full daylight. Back up every second of that footage to 2 separate locations immediately. And do not speak to anyone in that HOA for any reason. We're done responding. We're filing. It was concise, cold, and perfect. Everything I needed to hear. I did exactly that. Camera in hand, I circled the building, capturing every angle, every spray stroke, the shadows where sunlight hit the letters differently, the way it bled onto the mortar. Every photograph cataloged. Every detail logged. Then I backed up the footage twice, one copy on an external drive, one on cloud storage. Redundancy wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. By 9 a.m., I was dialing the police. I explained what had happened, calm and precise. Vandalism. Heritage property. Evidence on site. CCTV shows suspect. To my mild surprise, the responding officer took it seriously. They reviewed the footage with me, asked questions, and even took additional photos themselves. We'll be following up, the officer said. And I believed them, because for the first time since this campaign began, the law and reason felt aligned with me. I sat in the kitchen afterward, coffee in hand, staring at the building through the window. The morning sun hit the brass plaques just right, glinting across the engine company number 7 lettering. The bay doors looked unchanged, eternal. And the word, the vile red screaming word. It demanded attention, demanded reaction. And I made a promise. Quiet, complete, and unwavering. This ends now. On my terms. I poured the coffee down the sink and set about the rest of the day methodically. Every detail cataloged, every communication prepped for legal channels. I wasn't just angry. This was different. This was calculated fury. Controlled. Directed. I had no intention of letting it fester or be ignored. The stakes had changed. By mid-morning, neighbors started to notice. Walt leaned over his fence again, squinting at me from across the street. I see it, he said. That's wow. I didn't think they'd actually do it. They did, I said, not raising my voice. Just stating fact. And it ends now. Properly. Legally. Completely. He nodded slowly. You've got this under control. I do, I said. I wasn't lying. Every camera angle, every log entry, every backup of footage, everything had been secured. This was no longer harassment on paper. This was criminal. And I would treat it that way. I called George at the hardware store and gave him a brief update, not to alarm him, but to make sure he was aware in case someone tried to spin the story. They crossed a line, I said. Property has been vandalized. Documented, police involved, everything covered. I want everyone aware that this is escalating legally. He muttered something about people losing perspective, about obsession with order, and the danger of letting small power trip out of control. I listened, nodding. It was exactly right. Dennis, Deborah, Susan, they weren't neighbors anymore. They were operatives. Social pressure finds liens, now vandalism. I walked the perimeter of the building again, in mid-afternoon. Red paint still glaring. The sun hit the stone differently now, highlighting the curves and texture of the letters, the way it contrasted against the aged, proud masonry. I felt a resolve settle in. This wasn't about paint or signs or aesthetics anymore. It was about principle. It was about boundaries. And I would defend mine. That evening I reviewed the camera footage again, noting the time stamps, the movements, the way the suspect had approached, hesitated, executed, and retreated. I made notes, scribbled timelines, prepared for what Thomas had promised, legal action. And for the first time in this long, exhausting saga, the momentum felt like it was shifting. By nightfall, I wasn't thinking about the word, the red paint, the theft of peace. I was thinking about the strategy. The next move, the documentation, the filing. Every step recorded, every action intentional. Dennis and her group might have thought they were clever, intimidating, untouchable. I knew better. They just revealed exactly how far they were willing to go, and now the gloves were off on my side. I stood by the window one last time, staring at the fire station. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the brass plaques and bay doors. The word in red still blazed across the stone, ugly and deliberate. And I promised myself again, quietly, resolutely, this ends now. And it ends on my terms. I've never been a man who enjoys conflict. Lawsuits, courtrooms, and legal wrangling have always felt like a last resort, a necessary evil, if anything. I've paid bills, fixed plumbing, refinished floors, lived my life quietly. But there comes a point when absorbing injustice becomes more damaging than fighting it. That point had arrived. By now, the HOA had gone far beyond anything remotely reasonable. The lien, the fines, the notes in my mailbox, the neighbors being coached, and then the spray-painted vulgarity on the building, all of it had built up, compound anger pressing down in a way that left no room for patience. I sat with Thomas in his office, surrounded by the quiet hum of filing cabinets and the muted click of keyboards. He had laid everything out for me, step by step in his methodical, almost soothing way. "We're going after them as an organization," he said, tapping the stack of papers in front of him. "But we're also going after the individuals. Dennis, Deborah, Susan. Personal liability." I frowned. "Personal? You mean they can be held responsible individually?" Thomas adjusted his glasses and gave me that look he always gets when he's about to explain something as clearly as it can be explained, without impatience, but without sugarcoating either. "Yes. When individuals step outside the bounds of their authority, fraudulent liens, criminal acts, defamation, the corporate shell of the HOA doesn't protect them. That's the part that matters most. They're being sued as human beings, Hank. Their assets, their legal responsibility, their personal liability. Not the HOA's abstract existence." I nodded slowly. That part of it made my chest tighten. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist or a warning letter. This was a clear message. If you act like this, you pay the price personally. Thomas went on to outline the specific claims. Fraudulent filing of a lien, harassment, defamation regarding my character and property value statements made to neighbors and business owners, and criminal vandalism. I shivered at the last one, not because of the idea of going to court, but because the camera footage made it all terrifyingly concrete. He described it with his usual understatement, about as clean as evidence gets. "About as clean as evidence gets," I repeated, staring out the window at my building, imagining the red paint under the heritage plaque. It was almost surreal to think that the people responsible had walked around in daylight, pretending to be normal, smiling to neighbors, until the cover of night gave them the chance to act like vandals. Thomas leaned back and added, "She wore the jacket." He pointed at a frame from the footage he had printed. "The same jacket she's wearing in 14 other pieces of your camera footage. The same jacket her neighbors would recognize. She wore the jacket to commit vandalism on a heritage building at 2 in the morning." I tried to shrug it off. "People make mistakes," I said quietly. "Yes," Thomas said evenly. "And then other people file lawsuits." His calmness, the way he presented facts without venom, somehow made the injustice feel sharper. We went over the documents again. Every filing, every claim, every legal citation had to be perfect. No mistakes, no exaggerations, no assumptions. Every single allegation had to be backed by evidence. I had the letters, the certified notices, the camera footage, the mailbox notes, even logs of neighbors' statements. I hadn't realized how meticulously I'd been building my case, day by day, until now. "I'll need you to review these, sign them, and initial where necessary," Thomas said. "Then we file. Once these documents are in, the ball is officially in their court." I nodded, even though I already felt the weight of it. Filing was a strange relief, like stepping into the sun after a long winter indoors. It was methodical, it was deliberate, and it was something I could control. Wednesday afternoon, I signed the last page, initialed everything, and handed the stack to Thomas. I stepped out of his office into the daylight, and for the first time in months, felt something shift. The world didn't feel lighter exactly, but it felt level again, like the ground beneath me had returned to the same height as everyone else's. I hadn't wanted this fight, but refusing it any longer had only left me off balance. Now the rules were clear. The following week, the HOA was officially served. I was at home, pacing quietly, trying to keep my phone off my mind when Walt called. His voice was cautious, like he was reporting back from a battlefield observation post. "She came out of her house when the process server left," he said. "Just stood there on her porch for a while. Deborah came over. They stood together." "How did they look?" I asked, my hands gripping the counter. Walt paused. He thought carefully. "Smaller," he said finally. "Smaller than I've ever seen them." I let out a long breath, trying to imagine that in my head. Dennis, Deborah, Susan, the triumvirate of entitlement, diminished somehow, reduced by the weight of formal accountability. It didn't make me giddy. It didn't feel like victory. Not yet. But it felt right. Like the beginning of something that would end on terms that I, not they, controlled. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange sort of calm. I walked my property, inspecting the exterior, checking the brass plaques and the bay doors, making sure the heritage designation was secure, noting the camera angles. I even spoke briefly to a couple of neighbors who had looked puzzled by the sudden activity, but hadn't commented. Walt popped over later with a thermos of coffee, and we stood by the fence quietly, looking at the fire station in the fading sunlight. "You feel different, don't you?" he said. "I do," I admitted. "Not lighter. Not happy exactly. Just like it's time. Time to make them deal with what they've done." Walt nodded slowly. "Yeah, I thought you might. Dennis's smirk doesn't carry the same weight once there's a legal letter with your name on it." We sat there for a while, watching shadows creep across the stone steps, the brass catching the last hints of sunlight, the building looking exactly the same but somehow charged with a new authority. It wasn't over. Far from it. But filing the lawsuit had shifted the ground beneath the HOA, and it had shifted me too. That night I went inside and looked at my notes again. Camera logs, letters, dates, all of it lined up. I reviewed the claims one last time before heading to bed. I didn't sleep long. Adrenaline, tension, and anticipation kept me awake, but I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. For the first time in months, it felt like I was no longer defending a passive position. I was acting, on my terms by the rules with precision. I thought about Dennis, the way she must be reacting now, standing on her porch, imagining herself in control, probably scoffing at the paperwork she's never read. I imagined Deborah whispering to her, trying to muster bravado. Susan standing off to the side, quietly trying to gauge the strength of what she can't see. They might not understand yet, but they would. And I sat in my chair, coffee cooling beside me, and allowed myself a small, private sense of triumph. Not the giddy sort that comes with sudden wins. The slow, deliberate satisfaction of doing things right, of setting the stage for consequences that are real and unavoidable, of finally putting the gloves on and stepping into the ring fully prepared. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I filed. I observed. I waited. And for the first time since the first flyer arrived in my mailbox, I felt that the balance might finally be mine again. The day the lawsuit becomes a matter of public record, something unexpected begins to happen. I've spent months bracing for Dennis and her crew, for letters, liens, and vandalism, but I wasn't expecting allies not quite this way. Thomas, ever the calm voice, had mentioned it once before. When these things go public, it tends to open doors. People who have been silent suddenly feel empowered to speak. It's the strange psychology of legality, the way fear crumbles when others see that the threat isn't absolute. First to reach out are the Hendersons. They'd signed up with the HOA, believing Dennis's insistence that membership was mandatory. They called Thomas's office, cautiously, almost apologetically. We didn't know," they say. "We want to understand our options now." Their tone is a mix of embarrassment and relief. Thomas walks them through it patiently, step by step, explaining the voluntary nature of membership, the legal reality behind the fines and liens, and the protections the law offers. By the time they hang up, they've decided to withdraw their membership. The HOA has already planted the seeds of intimidation, and now the roots of uncertainty are pulling back. I watch the phone, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and disbelief. People actually have the courage to reclaim what was theirs all along. Then come two other neighbors, non-members who had received notices similar to mine but hadn't dared respond. They approach me quietly when I'm working in the front yard one morning, glancing around before speaking. We've been getting the same letters, one says, his voice low, almost confessional. We didn't know what to do, the other nods, equally tense. It's good to see someone push back. I hand them my business card with Thomas's office number, trying to convey reassurance. Call him. He'll guide you. You're not alone, I say, forcing my voice to sound confident, though inside my chest is a strange flutter of vindicated tension. It feels like a small victory, though I don't allow myself to smile just yet. George, the hardware store owner, is next. He intercepts me on the street, hands stuffed in his coat pockets, eyes darting toward his shop like he's worried someone might overhear. Hank, he says quickly, I should have said more when Dennis came in here. I wasn't interested in neighborhood politics, but I shouldn't have stayed silent. He scratches the back of his neck, a nervous tic he has when he's genuinely anxious. If it helps, I can provide a written statement about what I told her, about my lack of interest, just to make sure it's documented. I thank him, jot a note to pass along to Thomas, and he hurries back to his store, relieved, leaving me standing there in the crisp morning air, realizing that the ripple effect of public awareness is already beginning. The HOA, predictably, responds with its own attorney, someone Dennis clearly didn't budget for, someone who actually understands the law and knows the limits of her authority. The letter is thick with legal jargon, an attempt to reframe the issue as a community dispute, and an obligatory suggestion for mediation. I call Thomas immediately to read it aloud. Mediation, I say, the word tasting bitter on my tongue, as if the paper itself were coated in vinegar. They want to mediate, Thomas confirms, his voice even almost clinical. After the lien, I mutter, counting silently the months of harassment, the threats, the lies, the spray paint. After the letters. After the defamation. After the spray paint. I let the pause linger, just long enough to feel the absurdity of the request pressing against reality. Yes, he says. What do you think? I think. I pause, careful. People suggest mediation when they've looked at the evidence and done the math. They're calculating risk, and they've realized they're in over their heads. There's a small satisfaction in that, a cold amusement at the notion that a woman who once believed she ruled the street with a clipboard now has to consider consequences. I grin just a little. There's a quiet satisfaction in knowing they recognize the danger. Predictably, they decline. The case proceeds. And I watch, thinking about the months of tension, about Dennis's smug confidence, and I feel the slow, deliberate tightening of control now shifting toward me, the one she underestimated. Meanwhile, the building needs attention. I hire a professional crew to clean the stone facade and remove the vandalism. The red paint comes off more easily than I feared, leaving the stone gleaming in the morning light. I make sure the process is documented before, during, and after, every stage photographed meticulously, every movement logged. The cost of restoration will become part of the damages claim, each receipt another piece of evidence that Dennis and her associates have real consequences. The heritage plaque, untouched by the red spray, catches the sunlight exactly as it always has. I stand in front of it for a long moment, feeling the familiar solidity of history, of permanence, of something they cannot touch. Walt across the street waves again. A simple gesture, but it signals something. Other neighbors begin to follow, one by one, small acknowledgments of recognition and tentative approval. The social ecosystem, previously fractured by Dennis's influence, is beginning to right itself. I notice it in subtle ways. A neighbor holding open a gate when I walk past, another nodding in greeting where previously there had been only avoidance. Small, almost imperceptible gestures, but they accumulate into momentum, creating a web of tacit support that Dennis hadn't anticipated. I document those too. Every interaction, every hesitant smile, every subtle shift in the neighborhood atmosphere becomes part of the record in my mind. This is more than social validation. It is evidence that the influence Dennis thought unassailable is not absolute. Her authority was built on fear, misinformation, and the assumption of compliance. Remove those factors, and her world starts to crumble. I start noting times, distances, angles of view, who seems to be paying attention, who is. It's obsessive in a quiet way, methodical, and it keeps my mind off the lingering frustration that never quite dissipates. Thomas checks in periodically. "They're starting to feel the pressure," he says over the phone one morning. "It's subtle, but it's there. More people are coming forward. Statements, evidence, everything we need to build a strong case." His voice carries that same unflappable certainty, but I sense the underlying satisfaction of watching a calculated plan unfold. It's like watching dominoes set, finally, beginning to topple in sequence. I spend my evenings walking the property, inspecting the cleaned facade, noting the precise angles of sunlight, the way shadows play across the bay doors, the gleam of the brass plaque. Observation becomes preparation. Photography becomes strategy. Even the simple act of being present, visible, accounted for, is a demonstration of resistance. I take mental notes on the layout of plants, on who comes and goes, on which neighbors are paying attention. Every detail is another arrow in the quiver. The Hendersons, George, the other non-members, their quiet alignment with reality, their refusal to be cowed, it gives me a sense of reinforced momentum. The HO thought they could intimidate an entire street with letters, liens, and harassment. Instead, they've awakened something they did not anticipate: awareness, documentation, and collective refusal. I sense a subtle shift each day, the invisible weights Dennis tried to impose cracking under their own absurdity. It's a slow process. Nothing happens in a day. Social pressure is subtle, incremental, and measured. But by the end of the week, it is undeniable. Dennis's attempts to isolate me have failed. The spray painting incident has lost its sting, and even those who once nodded nervously at her demands now hold their heads higher. The balance has begun to shift, ever so slightly, toward reality. And I, who have spent months reacting, finally feel a glimmer of control, a sense that my actions, careful, documented, lawful, are creating actual results. And for the first time in months, I feel that I am not simply reacting. I'm observing, documenting, preparing. The cameras are more than tools, they are witnesses. The neighbors are allies, quietly lining up evidence by their actions and words. The pressure I once felt crushing and unilateral now meets resistance at every turn. Dennis and her cohort are no longer moving through the neighborhood unopposed. The first cracks are forming in what seemed an unshakable facade of authority. I stand in front of the restored building, early morning sun warming the stone. I feel cautious optimism, a sense that the tide may finally be turning. Not triumph yet, not victory, that would be premature. But momentum is gathering. Every witness, every ally, every careful photograph and note adds weight to a growing imbalance that Dennis cannot ignore. This is the counterpressure, the slow but inevitable response to overreach. And I am ready. The lawsuit never went to trial. Thomas had told me once, calmly, almost philosophically, that most of these cases settle before anyone sets foot in a courtroom. I accepted that without any sense of disappointment. The point wasn't the theatrics of a trial, it was the outcome. And the outcome in the end was meaningful. Not trivial, not symbolic, but real. Dennis, Deborah, and Susan settled personally. They paid from their own pockets, the settlement stipulating exactly that. The HOA itself remained intact, of course. It had legitimate members who joined voluntarily, and I had no quarrel with those people. But its claim to mandatory membership evaporated, formally documented. Its practice of sending fines to non-members, for so long a weapon of intimidation, ended. I remember the first time I read through the settlement agreement. I read it 3 times slowly, making sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. Every paragraph that confirmed the lien was rescinded, every clause detailing the compensation for the vandalism, the red paint splattered under the heritage plaque, felt like weight lifting from my shoulders. Even the defamation claims were acknowledged, the language careful, measured, but unmistakable. Dennis's statements about me and my building had no legal or factual standing. The document made it clear, with the precision of law, that these things were done, and that they could not be undone except by acknowledgement and compensation. Sitting at my kitchen table, the agreement spread before me, I thought about the cost. Not just the money, which was significant, though Thomas had explained how he had ensured it came out of their personal assets and not some a slush fund. Not just the time, the days and nights I had spent walking the property, checking the angles of the sunlight, watching for who came where, taking notes, documenting. Not just the hours spent speaking with Thomas, reviewing correspondence, preparing for filings, but the mental toll, the months of tension, of wondering whether another letter would arrive, whether another lien or fine would appear, whether the next step would be escalation. The sleepless nights after the spray paint incident, the quiet dread of seeing neighbors avoid my gaze, unsure of where the lines of loyalty and fear lay. And yet, in spite of all that, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Not triumph, that would have been premature and in this neighborhood probably unwise. Not revenge, I had never wanted revenge. But an acknowledgement of justice finally delivered. Not the dramatic courtroom flourish that novels make it out to be, but real, slow, bureaucratic, and entirely earned. The building stood, the plaques gleamed in the morning light, the brass fittings shone, and the old bay doors, carefully restored after years of use, reflected a history unbroken. I called Walt that evening. He arrived a little after dusk, carrying 2 beers in a paper bag, his own small ritual. We sat in the open bay where the engine used to live, the doors cranked open to the warm spring air. The light caught the heritage designation plaque just right, and I could see the reflection of the street in its polished metal. "You know what I thought about during all of it?" I asked him. Walt tilted his head. "What's that?" "The guys who worked here. The firefighters. The actual men and women who ran into burning buildings every day. They didn't know if they'd get out in one piece. They didn't know what the day held or what kind of call they'd get. And here I am, thinking I had it bad." Walt glanced at the plaque, at the stone walls, at the brass fittings, and then back at me. "Maybe," he said slowly. "But you didn't move either." I didn't have an answer for that. Not really. I just nodded, taking a sip of beer. We sat there in silence for a while, the neighborhood settling into the quiet of evening. The streetlights flickered on one by one. A neighbor waved across the street, another nodded from their porch. The world had somehow continued around us while I had been in the middle of this storm, and yet the building had endured, unbroken. I thought about Dennis and Deborah and Susan. Their efforts to intimidate, to manipulate, to assert control had failed. Not in one fell swoop, not dramatically but quietly, methodically. Their authority, built on fear and false assumptions, had met resistance that was patient, documented, and deliberate. The law had held. My diligence had held. The building had held. And in that, there was a satisfaction that no courthouse verdict could fully replicate. I walked around the building after Walt left, just before night fully settled. I checked the angles of the bay doors, the gleam of the brass plaques, the stone walls that had weathered decades. I traced the shadows of the evening sun and realized how many small details I had fought for: the careful documentation, the photographs, the camera angles, even the written logs of neighborly interactions. All of it mattered. Every detail was a thread in a net that had finally caught those who sought to harm without cause. I remember looking at the heritage plaque for a long time. It felt like more than metal on stone. It felt like the memory of the firefighters, the history of the city, the layers of care and attention that had been preserved in the building's structure. And it felt like me, or at least the part of me that had refused to be bullied into compliance, that had insisted on documenting, observing, preparing, and standing firm. I didn't dwell on what could have been worse. There had been 1,000 small opportunities for this fight to crush me, for it to spill into neighbors, for it to escalate into personal ruin. I didn't dwell on that. I only acknowledged it. And then I allowed myself to feel the quiet relief of a fight fought on principles and documentation, of resistance carried out with patience rather than impulse. A few days later, I walked the neighborhood. I greeted the Hendersons, who smiled with a touch more ease than they had before. George, the hardware store owner, gave a small wave. Others nodded. There was a subtle shift in the rhythm of the street, in the awareness that the previous fear-based social pressure no longer ruled the day. I kept a careful record in my mind, not out of obsession, but to appreciate the extent of what had shifted. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't anything you'd read in a storybook about good versus evil. But it was real. The red paint had come off, the lion was gone, the false claims had been acknowledged and compensated for, and the building, the station, the history had all endured. At night I sat in the bay again, sometimes alone, sometimes with Walt, sometimes just watching the quiet street. I'd pour a beer, lean back, and let my eyes trace the lines of the building I had defended. I didn't talk about victory. I didn't talk about revenge. I just acknowledged what stood: the building, the law, the careful, deliberate actions, and the persistence that had made it possible. That station, that old firehouse, had endured decades of use, neglect, and change. It had weathered the city's growth, fires, storms, and time itself. And now it had weathered Dennis Cloverfeld and her little campaign of intimidation. That fact, I realized, was enough. I never wanted to destroy anyone. I never sought to harm anyone beyond protecting what was mine. I wanted only to be left alone, to maintain the building that had been here since 1937, to honor the history it represented. And now I could. That was what the station stood for: endurance, integrity, and the quiet but unwavering assertion of what is right. The last night I spent in that period of relief, I poured myself a beer, settled into the bay, and looked at the plaque one more time. The sun had gone down, leaving the street lit only by the warm glow of the porch lights. And I thought, history holds. People may try to rewrite it, to bully it, to deface it. But in the end, persistence, patience, and adherence to principle hold longer than fear. Longer than false authority. Longer than threats. And the station, as always, stood exactly where it had always stood.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share.